What do you want? The question had no meaning to her, not at first, not even as the words settled into the cold air of the grand hall and lingered there like something fragile and dangerous, because Elena Whitmore had never been asked such a thing in all her 22 years, not when she was a child standing silently at the edge of lavish rooms, not when she was trained to lower her gaze and respond without hesitation, not when every decision had already been made for her before she could even understand the shape of a choice. And so she stood there now beneath the dim glow of chandelier light, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture flawless, her expression empty in the way it had always been, the way it had been molded into her through years of quiet correction and careful instruction. And across from her stood Duke Sebastian Blackwood, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break, his dark eyes fixed on her with something sharper than command, something unfamiliar, something that unsettled the stillness she wore like armor. Because he was not giving an order, he was waiting, and waiting was not something she understood, not something she had ever been allowed to experience. Her entire existence shaped around immediate obedience, around anticipating what was required before it was spoken, around becoming so efficient in compliance that her own thoughts had long since faded into something distant and unreachable. And yet now there was only silence stretching between them, heavy and unyielding. As the Duke took a single step closer, the sound of his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor, measured, deliberate, as if he were testing the space between them rather than crossing it. And Elena did not move, did not look up, did not breathe any differently, because movement without instruction was a mistake she had learned never to make. And still he did not speak again, did not correct her, did not replace the question with an order as any other man in his position would have done, and something in that absence began to press against her chest in a way she could not name, a faint, unfamiliar tension building beneath the surface of her calm, because the question remained, unresolved, waiting for something she did not possess. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Elena became aware of a quiet, terrifying truth, that she did not know what she wanted, that the answer did not exist within her, that there was only a vast, empty space where a choice should have been. And as the seconds passed, stretching longer than any silence she had ever endured, her fingers tightened ever so slightly against the fabric of her dress, a small, involuntary movement that betrayed the fracture forming beneath her composure, while the Duke watched, not with impatience, not with irritation, but with a steady, unyielding focus that refused to release her from the weight of his question. And in that moment, without raising his voice, without issuing a single command, Sebastian Blackwood had done something no one else ever had. He had placed a choice in the hands of a girl who had never been allowed to have one, and he did not intend to take it back. The silence did not break, and that was what made it unbearable, because silence in Elena's world had always been a space filled with expectation, a narrow bridge between command and obedience. But this silence stretched wider, deeper, as if it demanded something from her that she could not reach, and still she did not lift her eyes, though she could feel the weight of his gaze with a clarity that unsettled her breathing, each second pressing heavier against her chest until the stillness began to fracture into something sharper, something dangerously unfamiliar. And her mind, so carefully trained to anticipate instruction, searched desperately for the correct response, for the hidden order beneath the question, for the exact words that would satisfy him and restore the balance she understood. But there was nothing, no pattern, no expectation to follow, only that single impossible request echoing through her thoughts. What do you want? And the more she searched, the more she found. Only emptiness, a hollow space where an answer should have lived, and it frightened her in a way she could not explain, because it revealed something she had never been allowed to see, that she was not prepared for a life beyond obedience, that she had been shaped so completely by the will of others that her own had never been given the chance to exist. And her fingers tightened again, this time not by habit, but by instinct, a faint tremor passing through them as though her body was responding to a danger her mind could not yet name, while the Duke remained still, watching not with the impatience of a man denied, but with the quiet intensity of someone who refused to intervene. And that refusal was what unsettled her most, because it removed the structure she depended on, leaving her exposed to something vast and uncertain. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, not a command, not even a correction, but a steady presence that anchored the moment without controlling it. And he said, "Take your time." And the words were gentle in a way that did not belong in her world, because time had never been offered to her before, only taken, measured in tasks completed and expectations met, and now it stretched before her, undefined and open, and she did not know how to step into it, did not know how to exist within it. And for a brief, fragile moment, something shifted inside her, a faint awareness that she was standing at the edge of something vast, something that required her to move forward without guidance. And that realization sent a quiet panic rising through her chest, her breath catching just slightly, her composure faltering in a way so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him, never by him, because his gaze sharpened, not in judgment, but in recognition, as though he saw the crack forming beneath the surface she had so carefully maintained. And still he did not step in to steady her, did not replace the question with an order to spare her the discomfort. And that restraint was deliberate, precise, as if he understood that the moment would lose its meaning the instant he made it easier for her. And so Elena stood there, caught between what she had always been and something she could not yet become, her voice trapped somewhere deep within her, unfamiliar and unformed, until at last it surfaced in the faintest whisper, barely more than a breath, uncertain and fragile. And she said, "I do not know." And the admission lingered in the air, small and quiet, but heavier than any obedience she had ever given, because it was the first truth that belonged to her alone. And for the first time, the Duke did not correct her, did not dismiss her, but simply nodded once, as though that answer, incomplete as it was, mattered more than anything she had ever done before. The words lingered between them, fragile and unsteady, and Elena felt something shift the moment they left her lips, as though the air itself had changed, as though the world had tilted just enough to unsettle the balance she had always relied on. Because saying "I do not know" had not brought punishment, had not drawn correction, had not been met with the cold dismissal she had learned to expect whenever she failed to meet an unspoken standard. And that absence, that quiet acceptance, unsettled her more than any reprimand ever could, her breath catching slightly as she waited for the moment to correct itself, for the Duke to reclaim control of the situation and restore the order she understood. But he did not. He simply studied her with that same unwavering focus, as though her uncertainty held value, as though her lack of an answer was not a failure, but a beginning. And the thought was so unfamiliar that it sent a faint tremor through her composure, her hands tightening once more, before she forced them still, because control was the only thing she knew how to maintain, and losing it, even in the smallest way, felt like stepping into something vast and unsteady. And then, without warning, the Duke turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the long table set near the tall windows where the late afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting soft shadows across polished wood, and his voice followed that movement, calm and deliberate, as he said, "Come here," and the words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they settled differently than any command she had ever received, because they were not sharp, not absolute, not reinforced with the weight of expectation, and still, instinct guided her forward, her steps measured, precise, silent against the marble floor as she moved to stand where he indicated, her posture perfect once more, her expression carefully composed. But something within her remained unsettled, a quiet awareness that the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not fully understand. And when she reached the table, she stopped, waiting, because waiting was what she knew, what she had always done, and for a moment, there was nothing, only the faint sound of wind brushing against the tall windows and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the manor, steady and unchanging, a reminder of time moving forward whether she understood it or not. And then the Duke spoke again, his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind his words carrying something new, something deliberate, as he gestured toward two porcelain cups resting side by side, one filled with dark tea, the other left empty beside a small silver pot. And he said, "You may pour the tea, or you may leave it as it is," and the instruction, if it could even be called that, settled into her thoughts with a quiet weight, because it was not an order, not truly. It was a choice, simple and insignificant by any reasonable measure, and yet it felt larger than anything she had ever been asked to do. Her gaze lowering to the cups as her mind searched once more for the correct answer, for the hidden expectation, for the single path that would ensure she did not fail. But there was none, only two possibilities resting before her, both equally acceptable, both equally unknown, and her fingers hesitated at her side, a pause so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to her it felt endless, stretching far beyond the simple act it represented, because this was not about tea. It was about stepping into something she had never been allowed to touch, something uncertain and unstructured, and for the first time, Elena realized that choosing, even in the smallest way, required something she did not yet possess, a sense of self she had never been given the chance to form. And as the silence deepened once more, she became aware of the Duke's presence beside her, not imposing, not guiding, simply there, waiting again, always waiting. And it was that patience, that refusal to take the decision from her, that made her hand finally lift, slowly, uncertainly, toward the silver pot, her fingers brushing against its cool surface as though testing whether it was real, whether this moment was real, and her breath caught once more, soft and unsteady, as she hovered there on the edge of something new, something fragile, something that felt less like obedience and more like the beginning of a choice. Her fingers lingered against the cool curve of the silver pot, barely touching, as if the object itself might reject her, as if the act of choosing carried consequences she could not yet see. And for a moment, she remained suspended there, caught between movement and stillness, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing in quiet confusion, because there was no instruction to guide her, no voice to confirm she was correct, no invisible boundary marking the safer path, only the weight of her own uncertainty pressing against her chest. And the longer she hesitated, the more that unfamiliar pressure grew, tightening slowly, insistently, until it became something she could not ignore, something that demanded she act even without understanding. And that realization alone was enough to send a faint tremor through her hand, her fingers curling slightly before she forced them steady, because control, even now, was the only thing she knew how to hold on to. And yet this was not control, not truly. This was something else entirely, something fragile and uncertain that felt as though it might slip through her grasp the moment she tried to define it. And still, the Duke said nothing, did not intervene, did not offer the smallest hint of direction, his silence a deliberate space that refused to collapse under her hesitation. And in that silence, Elena felt something shift again, something small but undeniable, as though a quiet voice within her, one she had never heard before, began to stir, not with clarity, not with certainty, but with the faintest suggestion of preference, a whisper so soft it almost disappeared the moment she noticed it. And yet it remained, steady enough to guide her fingers as they finally closed around the handle of the pot, her grip light, uncertain, as though she expected it to be taken from her at any moment. And when it was not, when nothing interrupted her, she drew a slow breath and lifted it, the movement careful, measured, her wrists steady despite the tension that lingered beneath her composure. And the liquid inside shifted with a quiet sound, subtle and controlled, as she tilted it toward the empty cup, watching as the first thin stream of tea flowed downward, filling the space that had been left untouched. And the act itself was simple, almost insignificant, something she had done countless times before without thought, without pause. But now it felt different. Now it carried a weight she could not ignore, because this time, it had not been expected, it had not been required. It had come from her, however uncertain that origin might be. And as the cup filled, she felt a strange, unfamiliar awareness settle over her, something that did not belong to obedience, something that existed outside the narrow structure she had always lived within. And when she finally lowered the pot back to the table, her hand paused once more, hovering just slightly above the polished surface, as though reluctant to release the moment entirely, as though she understood, in some quiet, unspoken way, that something had changed, something small yet irreversible. And only then did she allow herself to withdraw, her fingers retreating slowly, her posture returning to its practiced stillness, though it no longer felt quite the same, and beside her, the Duke moved at last, not with urgency, not with approval, but with a subtle shift of attention, his gaze lowering briefly to the filled cup before returning to her. And there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, more deliberate, as though he had witnessed exactly what he had intended to see. And when he spoke, his voice carried no praise, no correction, only a simple acknowledgement that settled into the space between them with quiet certainty. And he said, "That was your choice." And the words, though soft, struck deeper than anything else he had said, because they did not belong to him. They belonged to her. And for the first time, Elena Whitmore felt the faint, fragile outline of something she had never known before, the beginning of a self that did not exist to obey, but to decide. The words settled into her more deeply than she expected, not loud, not forceful, yet impossible to ignore, because no one had ever claimed an action as hers before. No one had ever drawn a line between what she was told to do and what she chose to do. And now that line existed, faint but undeniable, and Elena felt it like a quiet echo moving through her chest, unfamiliar and strangely unsteady, as if something within her had been awakened without her permission, and she did not yet know what to do with it, her gaze lowering instinctively to the cup she had filled, as though searching for confirmation that it had truly happened, that the moment had not slipped past unnoticed, but the tea remained there, still and real, a simple reflection of a choice she had made without instruction. And the realization did not bring relief, it brought uncertainty, because if this was a choice, then there could have been another, and she had no way of knowing if the other would have been better, or worse, or if such distinctions even mattered. And that thought alone unsettled her more than any command ever had, because commands were safe, commands carried certainty, but choice introduced doubt, and doubt was something she had never been taught to navigate. And beside her, the Duke reached for the cup without urgency, lifting it with a steady hand, his movements unremarkable, almost ordinary. Yet Elena watched them with a quiet intensity she did not understand, as though the act of him accepting what she had done carried its own weight. And when he brought the cup to his lips, there was no hesitation, no indication that he questioned her decision. He simply drank, and that simple acceptance shifted something again, subtle but profound, because it meant her choice had not been corrected, had not been replaced, it had been received exactly as it was. And for a moment, the room felt different, not as vast, not as cold, as though the space between them had changed in a way she could not yet define. And when he set the cup back down, his gaze returned to her, steady and deliberate, and there was no expectation in it, no silent demand for the next action, only a quiet observation that seemed to wait for her to exist without being told how. And that absence left her uncertain once more, her hands returning to their composed position in front of her as she stood still. Because stillness was what she knew, what she could control, and yet it no longer felt complete, no longer felt sufficient, as though something within her now resisted the idea of simply waiting. And that resistance was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a faint tension beneath her calm, urging her towards something she could not yet name. And the Duke seemed to recognize it, because after a moment, he turned slightly away, not dismissing her, but shifting the focus of the room, giving her space without releasing his presence entirely. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same measured tone, calm and precise, yet holding something intentional beneath it. And he said, "You may remain here, or you may leave." And the words fell into the silence with a quiet finality, not an order, not a suggestion, but a clear division between two paths, both equally open, both equally uncertain. And Elena felt the weight of them settle over her, heavier than the choice before, because this was no longer about a simple action. This was about movement, about direction, about deciding where she belonged in a space that did not define her role. And her breath slowed, her thoughts tightening once more as she searched for the correct response, for the safe answer. But there was none, only the echo of his earlier words reminding her that the decision, whatever it might be, would belong to her. And the realization made her chest tighten, not with fear, not entirely, but with something more complex, something that felt almost like the beginning of understanding. And for the first time, Elena Whitmore hesitated not because she lacked instruction, but because she was beginning to recognize that the absence of it was the point. The choice lingered in the air long after his words had settled, stretching the silence into something heavier than before, something that pressed against Elena's chest with a quiet insistence. Because this time there was no simple action to complete, no small motion to guide her through the uncertainty. This was different. This required direction, and direction required something she did not yet understand how to find. And for a moment she remained exactly as she was, still, composed, her hands folded, her gaze lowered, because that was the version of herself she knew how to be, the version that required nothing from her except obedience. And yet that version no longer fit the space she stood in, no longer answered the question that had been placed before her, and she felt the tension of that realization slowly build, subtle but persistent, like a quiet pressure beneath her skin, urging her forward without telling her how, and her breath slowed, uneven for just a second before she steadied it again, because control was slipping in ways she could not fully contain, and the longer she stood there without moving, the more aware she became of the fact that stillness itself was becoming a choice, that even doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was a decision she was making, and that understanding unsettled her in a way she had not expected, because it meant there was no escape from this, no way to return to the safety of simply following. And across the room, the Duke did not turn back toward her, did not watch her with that sharp, steady gaze, but his presence remained, quiet and unyielding, as though he could feel the shift within her without needing to see it, as though he trusted the moment to unfold without interference. And that trust, that absence of control, was what made the silence feel different, not empty, but waiting, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elena lifted her head, not fully, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough to see the edge of the room, the tall windows where the fading light had softened into something dim and distant, the long hallway beyond the open doors, stretching into shadow, leading somewhere she had not yet been, and for the first time, she noticed it not as a path she might be sent down, but as a direction she could take, and the thought alone made her chest tighten, her fingers curling slightly before she forced them to relax, because movement without certainty still felt dangerous, still carried the echo of something she had been taught to avoid, and yet that quiet voice within her, the one that had guided her hand to the teapot, remained, faint but persistent, urging her towards something she could not fully understand, and she stood there, caught between the familiarity of remaining and the uncertainty of leaving, her thoughts circling, searching for the right answer, the correct response. But there was no correct answer, only the absence of one, and slowly, with a hesitation that felt almost like resistance, she shifted her weight, a small movement, barely noticeable, but entirely her own. And it was enough to break the stillness she had been holding on to, enough to carry her forward as she took a single step, quiet and measured, toward the open doorway, her breath catching just slightly as she did, because each movement now felt heavier, more deliberate, as though she was stepping into something unknown with every inch of ground she crossed. And she did not look back, not because she was certain, not because she understood, but because something within her told her that turning around would undo the fragile thing she had just begun. And so she continued, one step, then another, until she reached the threshold, the space between the room she had been given and the world beyond it. And she paused there, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the frame, her pulse unsteady beneath the surface of her calm. And in that pause, she realized something she had never considered before, that leaving was not disobedience, it was simply another choice. And behind her, the Duke's voice came once more, quiet, steady, not calling her back, not stopping her, but acknowledging what she had done with a certainty that settled deep within her. And he said, "Remember this, you walked there on your own." And the words followed her into the dim hallway, lingering long after she had taken her next step, as though marking the moment in a way she could not yet fully understand but would never forget. The hallway felt colder than the room she had left behind, though no draft touched her skin, no wind stirred the still air, and yet Elena felt it all the same, a quiet chill that settled beneath her composure as she took another step forward, then another, each movement carrying a weight she had never known before, because this was not a path chosen for her. This was not a direction given or expected. This was something she had stepped into without instruction, and the realization followed her. With every soft echo of her footsteps against the polished floor, steady and deliberate, yet unfamiliar in a way that made her breathing feel slightly uneven, and she became aware of it. That subtle change, that faint loss of the perfect control she had always maintained, and she tried to correct it, tried to return to the steady rhythm she had practiced for years. But something resisted, something small yet persistent, as though the act of choosing had altered more than just her movement, as though it had reached deeper, into the quiet space within her where nothing had ever been allowed to form. And now something was beginning to take shape, undefined and uncertain, but present all the same, and she slowed, just slightly, her steps no longer as precise as they had been, her posture still perfect, yet carrying a tension that had not been there before, because she was aware now, aware of herself in a way she had never been, aware of the fact that she was moving without being told, that each step belonged to her in a way that felt both fragile and overwhelming. And when she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped, not because she had been instructed to, not because there was someone waiting to guide her, but because she did not know where to go next, and the realization settled over her with a quiet force, because for the first time, there was no next command, no next expectation, only an open space that required her to decide again, and her gaze lifted slightly, scanning the hallway branching into two directions, one leading deeper into the manor, where the shadows gathered more thickly, the other turning toward a faint light that filtered through distant windows, soft and pale, and she stood there, caught between them, her breath steadying as she tried to understand what she was meant to do. But there was no answer waiting, no correct path marked out for her, only the same quiet question echoing beneath the surface of her thoughts. What do you want? And the words no longer felt distant, no longer felt like something that belonged to him. They felt closer now, heavier, as though they were beginning to take root within her, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in refusal, not in fear, but in an attempt to listen, to find something within herself that could guide her. And at first there was nothing, only the familiar emptiness she had always known. But then, faint and uncertain, something stirred, a quiet pull toward the light, not strong, not defined, but present enough to notice, and her fingers tightened slightly at her sides as she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifting toward that softer path. And for a moment she hesitated, the old instinct urging her to remain still, to wait, to avoid the risk of choosing incorrectly, but the silence around her held, unbroken, offering no correction, no interruption, and slowly, with a breath that felt more deliberate than any she had taken before, she turned, her body aligning with the direction she had chosen, and she began to walk, her steps quieter now, less measured, yet somehow more certain, as though each one carried a fragile thread of intention that had not existed before. And behind her, far beyond the walls and corridors that separated them, the Duke remained where he had been, not following, not calling her back, but aware in a way that required no presence. And though she could not see him, could not feel his gaze as she had before, the memory of his voice remained, steady and unyielding, reminding her that this path, however uncertain, was not given to her. It was taken, and for the first time, Elena Whitmore walked not because she was told to, but because she had decided to move forward. The light grew clearer as she followed it, soft at first, barely more than a pale glow stretching along the corridor, but with each step it expanded, spilling gently across the walls and floor until it reached her fully, brushing against her face with a quiet warmth that felt unfamiliar after the dim stillness of the hall behind her. And Elena slowed without meaning to, her steps no longer as precise, no longer bound to the strict rhythm she had always maintained, because there was no need for it. Now, no one waiting to judge the exact distance between each movement, no voice measuring her pace or correcting her posture, and that absence, though subtle, allowed something within her to loosen, just slightly, just enough for her to notice the difference, and she became aware of the way her breath moved through her chest, the way her hands no longer felt fixed in place but rested at her sides with a faint, unpracticed ease, and it unsettled her in a way she could not fully understand. because ease was not something she had been taught to feel. Only control, only restraint. And yet here, in this quiet stretch of the manor, there was nothing demanding either of those things from her. And she found herself looking up, truly looking, for the first time since she had arrived. Her gaze moving across the tall windows where the light entered, soft and diffused, illuminating the faint outlines of dust drifting slowly through the air. And the sight held her there, still and silent. Not because she was waiting, but because she was noticing, and the difference between those two states was small, almost invisible, yet it felt vast within her, as though it marked a boundary she had just crossed without realizing. And her fingers lifted slightly, not by command, not in response to anything external, but simply because she wanted to feel the light, to confirm its presence in a way that belonged to her alone. And the movement was hesitant, her hand rising slowly until it hovered. Within that pale glow, her skin catching the warmth as though testing something fragile and uncertain, and her breath stilled for a moment, not in fear, but in quiet awareness, because this, too, was a choice. Not one she had been asked to make, not one anyone would notice, but hers all the same, and the realization settled over her gently, without the sharp tension that had accompanied her earlier decisions, as though something within her was beginning to understand, to adapt, to exist without the constant weight of expectation pressing down upon it. And yet, even as that understanding formed, it brought with it a new uncertainty. Because if she could choose this, if she could lift her hand simply, because she wished to, then what else could she do? What else existed beyond the narrow boundaries she had always known? And the thought was both quiet and overwhelming, expanding outward in ways she could not yet contain, and she lowered her hand slowly, her fingers lingering in the light for just a moment longer before they returned to her side. And she stood there, not frozen, not waiting, but present in a way she had never been before. And it was then that she noticed the open doorway just ahead, partially hidden by the angle of the corridor, its frame worn slightly with age, the room beyond it filled with the same soft light that had drawn her forward. And she hesitated again, not from fear, but from recognition, because this was another moment, another threshold, another choice waiting to be made. And though no one stood behind her to guide her, though no voice called her name or instructed her to enter, the quiet pull within her remained, steady and patient, and she took a breath, deeper this time, more deliberate, as though preparing herself for something she could not yet see. And then, without waiting for certainty, without searching for permission, Elena stepped forward, crossing into the room as though it had always been meant for her to find, even if she had never known how to look for it before. The room received her without resistance, as though it had been waiting long before she knew how to arrive. And Elena paused just inside the threshold, not because she was uncertain of entering, but because something in the space itself held her there, quiet and open, filled with a softness that did not belong to duty or expectation, and the light stretched farther. Here, spilling across a wide window that overlooked the distant grounds, pale sky fading toward evening, the horizon softened by distance and silence, and for a moment she simply stood, her presence no longer defined by where she had been placed, but by where she had chosen to stand, and the distinction settled into her slowly, like warmth reaching through cold stone, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And her gaze moved across the room with a careful awareness, taking in the details without instruction, the simple arrangement of chairs near the window, a small table set beside them, books resting there in quiet order, their spines worn but intact, and something about them drew her forward, not with urgency, not with need, but with a quiet curiosity she had never been allowed to follow. And she stepped closer, her movement slower now, less restrained, as though she no longer feared the absence of direction. And when she reached the table, she hesitated only briefly before lifting her hand, her fingers brushing against the edge of one book, feeling the texture beneath her touch as if confirming that it was real, that she was real in this moment, acting without instruction. And the thought lingered as she drew the book slightly toward her, not opening it yet, simply holding it within reach, as though the act itself carried meaning beyond what she could yet understand. And her breath deepened, steady and quiet, as she stood there in the fading light, the silence of the room surrounding her not as an expectation, but as a space she was beginning to fill, and for the first time, she was aware of the absence of eyes upon her. No one watching to measure her actions, no voice waiting to correct them, only the distant echo of the choice she had made to come here, to stand here, to reach out on her own, and that absence felt vast, almost overwhelming, because it meant there was nothing left to follow, nothing left to mirror, only herself, and she did not yet know what that meant, did not yet know how to exist without the structure she had always depended on, and yet she remained, did not retreat, did not return to the safety of the corridor or the stillness of the room behind her. And that, too, was a decision, quiet and steady, unfolding without hesitation, and as the light shifted further, dimming slightly as the sun lowered beyond the horizon, she became aware of time passing, not as a schedule to be followed, but as something she was witnessing, something she was part of without being directed by it. And the realization settled into her with a quiet weight, because it meant she was no longer simply moving through moments defined by others. She was beginning to experience them for herself, and the thought lingered as she finally opened the book, her fingers careful as they turned the first page, the sound soft against the silence. And though the words before her did not yet hold meaning, though her mind had not been trained to engage with them freely, she remained there, looking, trying, allowing herself to exist within the moment without knowing exactly how. And far from that room, beyond the corridors and walls that separated them, the Duke stood, where he had been, not seeking her, not intervening, but aware in a way that required no presence, because he understood that what she was discovering could not be guided, could not be given. It had to be found, piece by fragile piece. And in that quiet room filled with fading light, Elena Whitmore took another step into a life she had never been allowed to imagine, not by command, not by expectation, but by the simple, uncertain act of choosing to remain where she was. The page did not speak to her at first, the words resting there in quiet stillness, formed with purpose yet offering none of it freely. And Elena stood motionless beside the table, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the paper, as if the meaning might rise through her skin rather than her mind, because she had never been taught to seek understanding for herself, only to receive what was given and carry it out without question. And now there was no voice explaining, no instruction guiding her eyes from one line to the next, only the faint awareness that she could choose to continue or close the book and walk away. And the realization lingered, subtle but persistent, because even the act of reading, was no longer a task but a decision. And her gaze moved slowly across the page, uncertain at first, her focus shifting between the shapes of letters and the spaces between them, as though she were learning to see something that had always existed yet had never belonged to her before. And her breath steadied as she remained there, not rushing, not retreating, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into something she understood. And as the silence deepened around her, broken only by the faint whisper of the pages beneath her touch, she became aware of the room again, of the way the light had dimmed further, casting longer shadows across the floor, of the quiet stillness that now felt less like emptiness and more like space, something open and waiting rather than defined and controlled. And she lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the table, the movement unpracticed yet deliberate, not guided by expectation but by a quiet decision she did not fully recognize until she was already seated. And the shift unsettled her for a moment, because sitting without being told to do so felt different, felt like crossing another boundary she had never been permitted to approach. And yet nothing followed, no correction, no consequence, only the continued stillness of the room. And her hands rested lightly against the book as she remained there, her posture still composed yet no longer rigid, her shoulders easing slightly as though the weight she had carried for so long had shifted, even if only by a small measure. And her gaze returned to the page, slower now, more focused, as though something within her was beginning to engage, to reach toward the meaning rather than wait for it to be delivered. And though the words did not fully form in her understanding, though their purpose remained distant, she did not turn away, did not close the book, because leaving now would not restore the version of herself she had been. It would only take her further from something she was beginning to discover. And that thought held her there, quiet and steady, as the last of the light faded into evening. and far beyond the room, beyond the corridor she had walked, the Duke remained where he had been, aware without presence, allowing the silence to do what no command ever could, because he understood that this moment, this fragile unfolding of something new, could not be shaped by force. It could only be given space, and in that space, Elena Whitmore remained seated beside a window she had chosen to approach, holding a book she had chosen to open, staying not because she had been told to, but because, for the first time in her life, she had decided not to leave. Time passed in a way she had never known before, not measured by tasks completed or instructions fulfilled, but by the slow shifting of light into shadow, by the quiet rhythm of her own breath, by the stillness that no longer demanded anything from her. And Elena remained seated, her fingers resting lightly against the open page, her gaze moving more steadily now, not because she understood every word, but because she had chosen to remain long enough for the act itself to begin taking shape. And something within her had changed, not suddenly, not completely, but enough for her to notice the difference between what she had been and what she was becoming. And the awareness settled into her with a quiet weight, because it brought with it a question she could no longer avoid. If she could choose this, if she could sit here and remain without being told, then what else had she never been allowed to discover? And the thought lingered, expanding slowly, reaching into places within her that had always been silent. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in retreat, not in uncertainty, but in an attempt to listen again, to find that faint voice that had guided her this far. And it was still there, subtle but present, no longer as distant as before. And when she opened her eyes, her gaze shifted, not back to the book, but beyond it, toward the window, toward the fading outline of the world outside. And she stood, slowly, deliberately, the movement unforced, not a reaction but a decision. And she stepped closer to the glass, her reflection faint against the dimming light. And for the first time she looked at it, truly looked, not as an image to be maintained, not as something to present, but as something to recognize. And the sight unsettled her in a way she could not explain, because she did not yet know who she was beyond what had been required of her. And yet the fact that she could ask the question at all meant something had already begun, something irreversible. And her hand lifted once more, this time not to follow instruction, not to test the light, but to touch the glass itself, her fingers resting against its cool surface as she watched the faint movement of her own reflection. And she remained there, quiet and still, not because she was waiting, but because she was present in a way she had never been before. And behind her, unseen but not distant, the Duke entered the room without sound, his presence steady and deliberate. And he did not speak immediately, did not interrupt the moment she stood within, because he understood that this was not something he could guide, only witness. And after a moment, when the silence had settled into something calm and unbroken, his voice came, low and even, not commanding, not questioning, but acknowledging. And he said, "You are not standing there because I told you to." And the words reached her slowly, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a truth. And Elena did not turn immediately, did not lower her hand from the glass, because she was no longer reacting without thought. She was considering, allowing the meaning to settle fully before responding. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, in a way it had never been before. And she said, "No." And the word carried something new within it, something small but undeniable. And for the first time, it did not feel like defiance. It felt like ownership. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, holding the weight of a moment neither of them would attempt to change. The word remained between them, quiet and steady, and Elena felt its weight settle more deeply than she expected, because it had not been shaped by fear, not guided by expectation, but formed from something within her that she was only beginning to understand. And she became aware of the silence that followed, not tense, not uncertain, but deliberate, as though the moment itself had been allowed to exist fully without being rushed or reshaped. And slowly, she lowered her hand from the glass, her fingers retreating with a softness that mirrored the quiet shift within her. And for a brief moment, she remained facing the window, her reflection faint against the dimming light, as if she needed that pause, that space to recognize what had just happened, to understand that she had spoken without waiting. without searching for approval, and that realization settled into her with a calm certainty that did not overwhelm her as it might have before, because something had changed, something had begun to take root, and it no longer felt fragile in the same way. It felt present, steady, even if it was still unfamiliar. And behind her, the Duke did not move closer, did not attempt to close the space between them, because he understood that distance now carried meaning, that it allowed her to stand where she had chosen to stand without feeling guided or contained. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same measured calm, not pressing, not testing, but opening something further. And he said, "Then tell me." And the words paused there, not completed, not directed, leaving space for her to understand what was being asked without being told how to answer. And Elena turned slowly this time, not with the automatic response she had once relied on, but with intention. Her movement deliberate as she faced him fully, her posture still composed, yet no longer rigid, no longer defined by expectation alone. And for a moment she did not speak, not because she did not know how, but because she was considering, allowing the question to settle fully before answering. And her gaze lifted slightly, not fully meeting his, but no longer fixed to the ground, and she became aware of the quiet tension within her, not fear, but the weight of forming something that belonged to her, something that had never existed before. And her breath moved steadily as she searched, not for the correct answer, but for something true, something that did not feel borrowed or shaped by what she believed he might expect. And it took time, more than she had ever allowed herself before, but the silence held, unbroken, giving her that time without interruption. And finally, her voice came, soft but clear, and she said, "I chose to stay." And the words carried a quiet strength that surprised even her, because they were not uncertain, not incomplete. They were a statement, simple and direct. And as they settled into the space between them, she felt something shift again, deeper this time, as though the act of naming her choice had made it more real, more defined. And the Duke watched her with that same steady gaze. But there was something different in it now, something that did not belong to authority, but to recognition. And he nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, as though he understood the weight of what she had just done. And the silence that followed was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with something quieter, something steady, as if a foundation had been placed where there had once been nothing at all. And for the first time, Elena Whitmore did not feel like she was waiting for what came next. She felt like she had taken the first step toward deciding it herself. The words remained between them, quiet yet unyielding, and Elena felt their meaning settle deeper with each passing second, not as something fragile that might disappear, but as something steady, something that had taken root within her and would not be undone by silence or uncertainty. And for the first time, she did not lower her gaze after speaking, did not retreat into the safety of stillness, but remained where she was, her posture composed yet no longer bound by the rigid expectation that had once defined her every movement. And the room itself seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because she was no longer standing within it as something placed, but as someone present, someone aware. And the distinction, though quiet, carried a weight that reshaped everything around her. And the Duke regarded her with that same steady calm, his presence no longer something that overshadowed her, but something that existed beside her. And after a moment, he turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window, toward the last trace of fading light beyond it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried no command, no expectation, only a simple truth that settled into the space between them. And he said, "Then you may choose again tomorrow." And the words were not instruction, not obligation, but possibility. And Elena felt them settle within her in a way that was both grounding and expansive, because they did not end the moment. They extended it. They allowed what had begun to continue, to grow beyond this single decision. And she drew a slow breath, not out of necessity, but out of awareness, as though she was beginning to understand that each moment ahead would carry the same quiet question, the same open space she had just stepped into. And that realization no longer frightened her as it had before. It remained uncertain, yes, but it no longer felt empty. It felt filled with something she was beginning to recognize, something that belonged to her. And she turned slightly, her gaze moving once more to the window, to the faint reflection of herself against the dim glass. And this time, when she looked, she did not search for the figure she had been. She did not measure her posture or correct her expression. She simply observed, allowing the image to exist as it was. And for the first time, there was no need to look away, and the silence that followed was not something to endure, but something to remain within, steady and unbroken. And when she finally moved, it was not to follow, not to obey, but simply because she chose to. Her steps quiet as she turned back toward the room, her hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair she had used earlier, the small contact grounding her in a way she could not fully explain, and she paused there, just for a moment, as if marking the space. The moment, the quiet beginning of something she had never been allowed to have. And though nothing around her had changed in any visible way, though the manor remained as it had always been, vast and silent, something within her had shifted beyond return, something that could not be undone or forgotten. And as the last light faded completely and the room settled into evening, Elena Whitmore stood not as someone waiting for direction, but as someone who understood, even if only in the smallest way, that her life was no longer something to be given to her. It was something she would learn, moment by moment, to choose.